If you are an individual out there who can name who threw the pass in the final play of the 2000 Super Bowl, who made the reception, who made the tackle to save the Super Bowl win at the 1-yard line, you have arrived at the right channel. This is pro football history right here. I'm Mark with my good buddy Izzy. How we doing?
Hi, Mark.
There is Izzy. I am doing great. I am so excited to be doing this. We've talked about this in some various forms for years, doing something like this.
Well, you've gone on and gotten so big as the voice of college football. I mean, I'm just flattered that you're taking a little bit of time away from your day job.
Well, I'm flattered that you would share your wealth of NFL knowledge and wisdom throughout the years and the insight. It's more so the insight that we get from you. So before we dive into this week's initial topic that is launching the channel, that was a selection made by Izzy, not by me. I can take no credit for this, where we're going to give you a bird's eye look at the timeline of NFL history. Of course, we need to talk about, how we became such huge pro football fans and then how we became friends as well. So you as a Packers fan, how did that all start?
Well, I'm the elder here. So my roots to the pro football world trace back much further than yours, young man. But as a kid growing up, I always wanted to live in a town or at least a state even that had a pro football team. And I never did. So everywhere we would move, I would just latch onto my dad's favorite team here, my, dad's favorite team there. He liked the Patriots in the 70s. He liked the Washington Redskins, the over the hill gang. So they were kind of my, de facto teams. My first memory of watching a game in the 70s on TV, it was probably a black and white TV. I don't have the details right, but I just remember the Vikings were playing, I think, the Packers. I wasn't a fan yet, but I seem to remember like the last play of the game, Ahmad Rashad caught a 50-yard pass and deked everybody in the team and the bench and the coaching staff to go all the way to win the game at the end.
This would have been a game in the old black and blue division, as it was called, right. The NFC Central.
So then one day my dad came home in 1978 and said, "Hey, everybody, we're moving to Wisconsin." And I didn't know much about Wisconsin, but I knew they had a pro football team. So that night, I made my mom take me to Sears Roebuck Company and buy me a Green Bay Packers knockoff jacket. Faux leather, the faux leather, the leather would peel off after time, after a few washings. And that was my team. Little did I know what heartache was ahead of me.
My family was not much of a sports family. They were not a sports family. I didn't grow up with all sorts of rooting for teams, even though I grew up about 45 minutes south of Cleveland in Akron, Ohio, Stowe, Ohio, to be a little bit more exact. And so my first recollection of an NFL game, Stowe, Ohio.
The home of the Sparkle Mart?
The home of?
The Sparkle Mart.
Well, yes. Sparkle Market, yes.
Oh.
Where I stock shelves like nobody's business, like no one else ever has before or since, where you could run a string down the aisle and the shelves were just perfectly aligned. But and also the home of Larry Zonka, Pro Football Hall of Famer, played at Stowe High School. So we could do an episode. As you were speaking, Izzy, I must have thought of like 12 different episodes that we could discuss. Like nicknames. You brought up the Minnesota Vikings. I thought Purple People Eaters. Great nicknames throughout the history of pro football. In the black and blue division, another nickname.
See what you have to look forward to? You tune into the Pro Football History Channel?
This is going to be so much fun. I'm just going to won't be able to
Growing up in
contain
Cleveland, I
myself.
would assume you were a Browns fan all that time then.
No. You know better than that. So
I'm trying to
although
bump that spike.
you came along later in life after I had disowned this team because of a tragic mistake and decision that was made. So my first recollection of an NFL game was we had these good friends from our church, and they invited us over for Thanksgiving. And this was late in the 1977 season. And we were watching the Thanksgiving Day games, and the Buffalo Bills were playing, of course, one of the two teams that always play on Thanksgiving, the Lions. They were playing the Detroit Lions. And we don't necessarily need to get into the aftermath of this individual's life, but I remember this guy pointing at the screen, this guy that was very close to our family. And he said, Mark, that's the best football player on the planet right there. And it was O.J. Simpson. And I immediately just became a yes, he became a little even more known following his playing days. But I immediately became fascinated with this game, and just and this is how I approach things in life. You know this, that I become a little obsessed with things, and when I really like something, I really like it. So I immediately loved the NFL, and I just became immersed in, we've discussed this many times, Izzy, where on Sunday we would get the Major League Baseball statistics each Sunday during the baseball season. It was similar with the NFL, where I just couldn't get enough of absorbing box scores and just every little statistic. And so I took off from there. So my first favorite team was the Minnesota Vikings, actually. You mentioned having the Green Bay leather jacket with the leather sleeves, the fake leather sleeves. I had a Minnesota Vikings one like that with the
we wouldn't
beanie.
Have been friends back in those days.
No, I was a big I had Fran Tarkington pictures in my my bedroom. The Purple People Eaters. I loved all those guys. So, but that was short-lived because Fran Tarkington's last season was 1978.
Well, there's a little similarity because it was a play for me, the 50-yard catch to win the game that captured me. I'd watched games before that. I'd watched the Super Bowls in the early to mid 70s and all that, but that is just more like, okay, here's something I'm watching. But that play captured me. I was like, wow, that's kind of fun. Same way watching O.J. Simpson captured you.
Yeah, it did. And
but you went to a different team, didn't you?
And then I quickly transitioned to the Dallas Cowboys. The whole brand, the whole image, the aura just captured me.
They were bad boys. They were known as bad boys with a good coach, a good boy coach.
They were bad boys. It was America's team. On. The Pittsburgh Steelers.
Okay.
All you had to do was look at the uniforms. The Cowboys were the good guys wearing the white hats, and the Steelers were the bad guys wearing the black hats. That was good and evil right there when the Cowboys and the Steelers would meet in a Super Bowl. And that was the first pair of Super Bowls that I just became locked into, was the Cowboys win over the Broncos. And then the next year they lost, or many Cowboys fans would say they were ripped off by the officials in Super Bowl 13. And that will be a future episode we'll discuss at some point. Super Bowl 13, a 35-31 loss to the Steelers.
Now, Mark and I, folks, we go back a long ways. 1996, 7?
I was going to say 5.
5,
it was
maybe.
95.
We were both living in a small town in Mississippi, and we ran into each other through the course of events. And he was, into football. I was too, and I dared ask him I popped the big question. I asked him if he likes to watch the NFL draft, because very few people I would admit to at that time, I would hide my addiction. And he did. And so we watched the 1990 NFL draft together, cover to cover. and we've been talking football ever since.
Absolutely. Was that the John Michaels draft?
That was the John Michaels during. We'll get into that in a show also, but yes, that was the John Michaels draft, not the Ray Lewis draft. So, but I guess the reason why I'm excited about doing this show, Mark, is I have a lot of memories from decades worth of watching football. I raised my kids watching it, and I know there's a lot of people that love it now, but don't have that connection to the past. And I just think it would be, I don't know, broaden their experience all the more. So tune in here each week and learn a little nugget of wisdom or history, and it'll make your love for the game grow.
It's going to be a whole lot of fun. So again, we're going to grind down to the granular during future weeks, but we wanted to give that broad perspective on what has made this the most popular sport in America. And so it all started back in 1920, but that was with the NFL itself. It preceded that, of course, with the game of football.
Right. And really, I don't think it's any shock to anybody that football has its roots in the game of rugby, which I guess is a game that people play. But in the late 1800s, a famous guy named Walter Camp decided to kind of tweak the game of rugby a little bit. He changed some of the rules of rugby. For example, if you've ever watched a rugby scrimmage or whatever it's called, there's constant motion. It's like a hockey game. They're always going, right? And Walter Camp invented the concept of a line of scrimmage and down and distance and plays to gain to that line to gain. And two things that are even to this day forbidden in rugby, Camp added to his new version. First is the forward pass. In rugby, you can only lateral. And blocking. Blocking is illegal in rugby, although you couldn't tell me that by watching. Like, there's a whole mass of humanity moving together. But he added blocking to the game as well as part of the plays. So this new thing he created kind of became popular because it was fun to play. And colleges started picking up as a club sport. And then in the end of late 1800s, then as team sports. And as time went by, the players who played in college, would graduate from college and be living regular life, but still enjoyed playing the game. So clubs started to spring up. All right. And, I guess it's probably still in maybe the 1890s. At that time, it was sort of considered dishonorable to be paid to play a game that people come watch for enjoyment. Can you imagine that today? Would that work today? So
yeah, we've kind of taken it to the other extreme.
So anyway, in Akron, Ohio, there was some guy with a funny name who became the first guy to get paid cash money for playing the game. He was paid $500 to play in a game. And then after that, the team started kind of secretly paying their players. They had to do it kind of under the table, again, because the general public viewed that as kind of like, not very gentlemanly, not very gentlemanly, Lovey. So, but then eventually, that stigma was broken, and a professional league, the one you mentioned in 1922, which was called some other stupid name, which after a year or two, they said, that's a dumb name. Let's call ourselves the NFL, became the first organized professional league.
Yes. It was something.
That's kind of how we get from like the 1800s to when it was in, and you're an Ohio guy, right? It was in a parking lot of a car dealership in Canton, Ohio, where they cobbled together these 14 teams that would occasionally play each other and play other teams too, but it was a loose affiliation that was considered the National Football League. So that's kind of the days leading up to it.
Yes, the American Pro Football Association. It had a bunch of, it was a very formal sounding name that was a little cumbersome.
Right.
and then they came together as the NFL just a couple of years into its existence. I believe 1920 was the establishment of the league, and then 1922 the NFL. And yes, and you just outlined why the Pro Football Hall of Fame resides in Canton, Ohio, just down the street from where I grew up. So I am proud. I never really sunk in, but I took a little pride there from growing up and calling home as being right in the middle of all that in Akron/Canton, Ohio, in that area, with the Canton Bulldogs being one team in particular with Jim Thorpe.
And I mean, most of the towns were kind of smaller towns. I mean, Canton's, it's no Cleveland, right? So of those 14 original teams, none of them by name still exist today. The next year in 21, an outfit up in Wisconsin, the Green Bay Packers, joined the league, and they, in 1921, have been the longest consecutively same named team. That didn't even make sense, but to still exist today. Now, one of the original 14 teams, the Decatur Staleys, I believe they were, moved to Chicago in 1922, 2 years later, and then eventually changed their name to the Chicago Bears. So technically you could trace the Bears back to 1920, that original list of 14.
The Bears and the Cardinals are the first two franchises. They preceded the Packers by 1 year, but as you mentioned, the Packers are the first and only to have continued in one location with the same name for the longest period of time. Yes, the Green Bay Packers, and now we've got what most people would consider to be the greatest rivalry in the sport, the Bears and the Packers, and certainly the oldest one, and having played the most games.
Right, and I think, I mean, if you look at the record, it's pretty even Stevens so far after all these 100+ years.
Now, at the same time, it's not like pro football just took off the NFL as some amazing sport that everyone was enamored with. It was a baseball, boxing culture, and college football, as a football comparison, was the more popular sport.
Well, and interestingly, you're right. I mean, the league probably was just a thing that people watched and played in these smaller towns. But then if you remember from geometry class and from algebra 2, the concept of a point of inflection, where a curve, which is kind of slowly increasing, sort of changes its course quickly. And there are, throughout the history of the NFL, there are these points of inflection. And in 1932, there was kind of the first point of inflection that really sort of kickstarted things. There was the first playoff game, and it was actually played indoors because of some inclement weather, and it was extremely popular. Like, they were really surprised. Wow, this was extremely popular. So on the heels of that, they reorganized the league into two different divisions, who would then play toward a championship at the end of the season. And they also changed a few rules. I had mentioned earlier about the Walter Camp's invention of the forward pass. Prior to that point, any forward passes had to be made 5 yards back from the line of scrimmage. Okay. You know how nowadays with replay, they'll be looking to see if a guy has crossed the line of scrimmage before he throws. Back then it was 5 yards back. And in 1932, as part of this kind of reinventing the game because of the growing popularity, that's when they also changed that rule to make it so you could throw up to the line of scrimmage. So game was growing quickly at that point.
Yeah, that first decade and a half of NFL championship games, which started in 1933, involved a lot of games with the Bears, the Packers, the Giants, the Redskins. I know that the Redskins won the greatest, what still stands as the largest point differential, and ironically, it was in the NFL championship game, 73-0. And I don't have the exact year on that. It was like 37 or 43. It was in that range of the late 30s, early 40s. And Don Hudson, one of your famed Packers, was one of the great early players in the league, and Bronco Nagurski and Red Grange.
You know, and we'll get into this in future episodes as well, but the passing game, which was in existence, was not the dominant force that we know today, right? And Don Hudson, back in his day, in one season caught 99 passes, which that would be like 200 or more today, maybe even more than that.
It was the equivalent of Babe Ruth, who at the time that the home run ball took off, basically was out homering franchises. You know, the home run record went from 9 to 11 to 13 to bam, 59 and 60, like overnight. And that's like Don Hudson catching that many passes in a season was just phenomenal.
So we have 1920 is an important year. That's when the league was formed. We have 21 when the Packers joined, which is extremely important. So, and then we have the 1932 game, the playoff game we've mentioned. In 1936 is another point of inflection, and that's the first college draft in 1936. And I don't know who the guy was, but he was the Heisman Trophy winner that year.
Jay Berwanger from the University of, from what is now Northwestern, correct? It was Chicago. Jay Berwanger.
He opted not to play. He didn't play in the NFL. He was like, I got other things to do.
What this also brings to mind, Brent, that has stayed in my mind forever, has been that Betty Feathers was the first NFL rushing champion of the Philadelphia Eagles. Betty Feathers.
So they were integrated. That's a bad joke. Sorry. Betty Feathers?
Betty Feathers was the first NFL rushing champion.
That's why we have this guy on the show here. Encyclopedic knowledge.
It's dwindled through the years. It's not. This may cause it to sharpen back up. It's. I once told Izzy. I remember one time you visited me at work, there in Mississippi, and you let me know that you had attended a Packers Cardinals. Is this correct? 1982 NFL playoff game.
Yes.
That was a 41-16 Packers win. At which point I let you know that I knew the score of every NFL playoff game in history since the merger.
And then I genuflected.
And I can no longer claim that. I can no longer claim that, unfortunately.
Well, I'm sure it'll come in handy here occasionally.
Yes.
Also in the 30s, the Steelers and the Eagles were added. Interestingly, during World War II, when many of our best and brightest were shipped overseas, the teams merged together even in and of themselves. And I want to say the Steelers and Eagles were a team. I'm not sure about that, but that was happening during the war.
So
are we coming across our first?
Are we coming across our first possible fact check that we need to make? Because I can't confirm that.
A few of those. Just when I pitched the interruption to you, we had the buzzer that was going to ring. Anytime I said something that was like way out of there. Because
there's also a point of contention here with Betty Feathers. There's also a distinction of Steve Van Buren. You remember that name?
He was the president of the United States.
Steve Van Buren.
Oh, his brother Steve.
There's another distinction that he had. So I'm gonna get back to you on those when I name Betty Feathers as the first rushing champion.
You fact check yourself.
Because
things kind of hung along though, and the popularity grew slowly. In the 50s, the Browns and the 49ers were added. Certainly significant franchises, right? And there was the greatest game ever played during that era.
Yes. Before we get to that.
Yeah, we can't give too much away.
Before we get to that, Betty Feathers was the first player to rush for 1,000 yards first player to rush for 1,000 yards in a season in 1934.
Which is impressive. They probably didn't play 17 games.
No, they didn't play
That was
17
just
games.
announced today. Wasn't that? That was just announced.
That was
17
today.
games.
Yes, Derrick Henry has yet to play in 17 games either, but he may next year. So
So anyway, that's the 50s. Anything to add to? We're going to skip over the greatest game ever played because that's going to be a show for another time.
well, of course, yeah, we're not going to dig deep into it, but Giants Colts, and the big deal there was number one, it went to overtime, and I don't know if some of this is hyperbole based on, it's a good story, but there sometimes you'll see interviews and they'll talk like the officials looked at each other, kind of like, what do we do now, kind of thing, like there was no rule in place for this.
I've only seen clips of the game, but I always call that the greatest game played up till that point.
Well, yeah, I doubt if it was even the greatest game.
People in the game, obviously, and lurking over on the sidelines, a couple of famous coordinators.
Oh my goodness,
well.
yes. With the New York Giants offensive coordinator Vince Lombardi, the defensive coordinator being Tom Landry. That's another show for another time as well, because I always found it ironic that Landry coached the defense and Lombardi the offense, because when they split and coached the Packers and the Cowboys, Landry was the offensive innovator and Lombardi ran such a simple offense in comparison.
Right.
And so the Baltimore Colts won the game in overtime. Tom Matte, I believe, scored the game-winning touchdown. And John Unitas, of course, the quarterback. He was only 25 at the time, and that kind of
Frank Gifford, place kicker. No,
Frank Gifford, halfback. Yeah,
Pat Summerall,
place kicker. Frank Gifford, halfback. For the New York Giants, and there was a controversial play in which Gifford, there was a controversial play late in the game where Gifford thought he got the first down, and most likely the Giants would have run out the clock. But
and so I guess the reason we paused here at that game is because, again, to have a working knowledge of the history of the NFL, you need to really know of that game, because it was a point of inflection. It was again, another step up in the popularity that got us to where we are today.
Yeah, it was nationally televised and had an enormous TV rating, and launched the league, which 2 years later, the AFL was founded, the American Football League, 1960 by Lamar Hunt.
Right. The American Football League, and there had been leagues springing up here and there, but none of them really ever. In fact, I think there were like 2 or 3 previous AFL attempts through the decades that they all failed. But this one, Lamar Hunt, he's a pretty smart dude, and he had some innovative ideas. So this is an important moment in the history of the NFL when the AFL comes onto the horizon.
To note very quickly, 10 years earlier, there was an All-American Conference that played a different pro football league. It dissolved, and 2 of the outstanding members that stayed in the NFL were the Cleveland Browns and the San Francisco 49ers. And the Cleveland Browns were so good that they actually entered the league and won the first NFL championship in which they were part of the league. But we get back up to the AFL. The AFL distinguished itself in a number of ways, knowing that the NFL by that point was considered to be established, wouldn't be by our standards now, but considered to be established. So a lot of the smart people involved in developing the league, including Lamar Hunt, knew that they needed a way to attract an audience, and it was by throwing the football.
Yeah, it's kind of like, when you're the only show around, you don't necessarily have to innovate, right? And so that's how things become dinosaurs. And the NFL at that point was like an Oldsmobile. It was like a Buick, it was like a Pontiac, sturdy, reliable, it'll get you from point A to point B, but like you said, I mean, when the AFL came around, they said, well, let's put a sports car out there and see if we can draw some attention away. There's the advent, they're pushing the passing game. They secured a lot of TV contracts, which was something that the NFL hadn't totally eschewed, but hadn't taken advantage of to the degree to which they could have based upon the popularity. And the AFL did. And the AFL also had a pretty big war chest. And they set about trying to steal away players from the NFL, particularly during the NFL draft. This was all repeated again with the USFL, 20, 30 years later. But
and actually, the World Football League only about 15 years later.
Sure.
1974-75, Jim Kick, Larry Zonka, and Paul Warfield. Joe Namath was probably the player that was the most popular landmark get for the upstart AFL. And the amount of money that he was paid was just obscene at the time. I think his contract was $450,000.
Yeah, he was paid a lot of money. So that's what I'm saying. I mean, the AFL said we're gonna steal the thunder by having a more interesting game, by being on TV, and by paying these guys to come play for us. And at first, the NFL sort of kind of thought, well, that upstart over there, yeah, whatever. But eventually the collision course could not be avoided.
So there was a decision made sometime, I believe, in 1965 that following the 66 season, that even though they were still separate leagues, that their champions would play in the first AFL-NFL championship game, which now is the Super Bowl. In
fact, you might want to get your buzzer out here because I could be wrong on some of these details, but in a future show, there'll be famous plays from history that you need to know about. And one of them is Bart Starr doing a quarterback sneak behind Fuzzy Thurston to win the NFL championship against the Dallas Cowboys. But that was the game that placed him in kind of an afterthought game, the game that is now the first Super Bowl on record. Do I have those details down?
You've got it. Bart Starr was smart enough to recognize that Jethro Pugh, the outstanding defensive tackle for the Dallas Cowboys, tended to stand up a little too. He did not gain a lot of leverage despite being an all-pro player, and that would be their opportunity to get under his legs and get just enough room to score the game-winning touchdown. And yes, Vince Lombardi actually made a comment after the game about the Dallas Cowboys being the second best team in professional football, and basically this was the championship game.
Right. Ironically, it was considered the championship game. The what we now call the Super Bowl was just a game to be played after the championship game, and it's ironic that then the Super Bowl's trophy would be named after the guy who considered the game before that game the championship game.
Yeah, and if you see programs from the first Super Bowl, it does say either NFL, AFL, or AFL, NFL championship game, and it was played in January of '67 at the LA Coliseum, and it was so disregarded that there were roughly 30,000 empty seats. The way my mind works is I will let you know that at one point, just about every Super Bowl statistic was stuck to my mind, including the exact attendance of the first Super Bowl, 61,946.
And one of them was not a 6-month-old Izzy.
Or a negative.
I was a toddler, so I don't remember that game. But yes. The program that I've seen from it calls it the AFL NFL World Championship. So you had your NFL championship, but now this is for the world.
Yes, the World Championship.
So because down in Brazil and over in Liechtenstein, their leagues maybe not quite as important, So
for as much as I'd love to dig into the Super Bowl one, because a lot of things come to mind, obviously that again will be a future episode. So we'll just let everyone know that of course the Packers dominated the NFL in the 60s, culminated by 2 NFL championships / then Super Bowl championships in Super Bowl 1 and 2. So the NFL, the old guard, held, thanks to the Packers, through the first 2 Super Bowls as enormous favorites that led us into Super Bowl 3. and a landmark game in history because the AFL again attempted to win this World Championship game, and it was Super Bowl III in Miami at the Orange Bowl. The Jets, a 17-point underdog to the Baltimore Colts, pulled off the amazing upset with Joe Namath guaranteeing the win.
Guaranteeing. And it wasn't until 1970 that the total merger happened, where they redid all the league, the two conferences and everything. So there was, it was kind of like us against them and, mentality in those early years of the Super Bowl. It was a David versus Goliath mentality, and they showed them.
So again, we'll dig into that game, and it's fascinating to see. I'm fascinated by the whole emergence of the AFL, the NFL being the old guard, the 4 Super Bowls that were played as distinct leagues, because there was one more played after that, the Vikings and the Chiefs, and despite the Jets win over the Colts as a overwhelming underdog, the NFL was still a huge favorite the next year. The Vikings were a 14-point favorite against the Chiefs the next year, and the AFL won again to even the series at 2-2. Then came the NFL merger, as you mentioned. But with the NFL having more teams, some of those teams, and I don't know, maybe we can dig into this when we get into the merger, which could be like a 3-parter, who knows, when we dig into the NFL merger, is that I got to think, Izzy, that some of those old guard NFL teams like the Cleveland Browns, the Baltimore Colts, weren't real happy. The Pittsburgh Steelers, even though they were not a significant team from a winning standpoint, they had been with the league since the early 30s, if not before that they probably didn't want to be part of the AFC, but that was their
I would
assignment.
love to be a fly on the wall in that decision-making room as to who goes over there, who goes over to the other guys.
Because I think those were the 3. I think that was it. Steelers, Colts, Browns.
It'd be interesting to see how that was decided. We'll look into that a little more in a future show. But you mentioned, the old guard, and that reminded me of another thing that the AFL did to kind of make it a more fun game. They put the players' names on their jerseys as well, which, some of colleges have been slow to do this as well, right? And so the NFL's like, oh, we're a team, nobody's more important than anybody else. But the NFL's like, hey, look, we're stars. We have stars. We want to highlight some of our people, individuals. And that caught on, and that was adopted by the NFL then as well. So sometimes it takes, a change of, an agent that comes in, just kind of a little fly in the ointment that kind of brings about the changes that get us to where we are today.
So, Izzy, the 1970s were not just a time in which both of us fell in love with the NFL and became of age, but in that way as NFL fans, but it was a very important decade for the NFL. The NFL just exploded in the 70s.
Right. I mean, rivalries became a big thing. You mentioned earlier the Steelers versus the Cowboys. That became such a rivalry that Charlie Daniels even sang about them in the top 40 hit. So I think the 70s, the popularity grew, but there's a moment in the 70s, and I know you know what I'm thinking about, where perhaps the most significant changes were made that got us to the game that we know of today. In 1978, there were several changes that were made to how the game was played that encouraged more passing of the ball. And again, you got to tip your hat to the AFL for sort of bringing this, aspect to the game. And in 1978, it's a very important moment. If you want to understand NFL history, you need to understand the rule changes that occurred in 1978 that made it easier to pass the ball.
Yeah. So if you flipped on the game that I did and the people around me at Thanksgiving in 1977 and saw O.J. Simpson run for 250 yards, and had I been sophisticated enough of a fan, I would have noticed that wide receivers would have been grabbed by the jersey, thrown down, basically tackled, running downfield for passes anywhere in the open field. And it was almost impossible for offensive linemen, particularly tackles, to block in the ways that they were forced to block and keep out the pass rush. But those were the two significant rules changes that you're alluding to, is that the Chuck rule was then instituted, that a defender could only hit the offensive player, the wide receiver, typically one time within 5 yards of the line of scrimmage. Otherwise, technically, they couldn't touch them. Now, of course, they do.
Well, and this is why you need to watch the Pro Football History channel, because you're gonna, if you're new to the game or you're a young person and you open up the stats for, say, for example, Aaron Rodgers, he has 300 touchdowns that he's thrown, and he's thrown 89 interceptions, or maybe it's 489. I don't know, some crazy number. Then you hear somebody say, "Oh, there's this great quarterback from back in the day named Johnny Unitas," and you open up his stats. Well, he's almost got as many interceptions as he does touchdowns. This guy couldn't have been any good. You can't compare players from era to era without taking into consideration some of these changes that occurred in the game.
Joe Namath roughly threw 50 more interceptions than touchdowns in his career. Terry Bradshaw's TD to pick ratio was 222 to 220. Kenny Stabler threw more interceptions than touchdowns. Yes.
Hall of Fame quarterbacks all.
Yes, so some of the passing statistics from those days are just the Dolphins. We'll mention very quickly, of course, the last undefeated team in the NFL won back-to-back Super Bowls. They won those Super Bowls with Bob Greasy going 8 for 11 and 6 for 7 in those two Super Bowls.
And that's not to say that the passing game didn't exist. I mean, many of the highlights you'll see from those 70s Super Bowls, Terry Bradshaw throwing to Lynn Swan or John Stallworth, these deep passes. But it wasn't. I guess the mantra back then was the run sets up the pass. And now we've come 180 from that. And, well, for a while it was the pass sets up the run. And now it's like the pass. Oh, we'll throw a run in there every now and then just because we can. So
yeah, you generally knew that. Yeah, you generally knew teams were going to run on first down, most likely second down, and then they throw in a play action pass on third down. And they were going to line up in an I formation just about every play. But we talked about the passing game, Bill Walsh, and before him, Paul Brown, and we'll get into that development.
Right. Some scientists, some really, really smart people came along and said, "Oh, you changed these rules? How can we maximize that now for our benefit?" And Bill Walsh would be one of the early tinkerers taking advantage of it.
Yes. And Bill Walsh will give, and we'll dig into this, a lot of credit to his forerunners being Paul Brown and Hank Stram, because they would throw the ball to the running backs out of the backfield more so than their contemporaries. But Bill Walsh and the West Coast offense, led by Joe Montana, ushered in a new era of the passing offense, of course. Dan Marino, John Elway in the 80s. So where's our next milestone?
Well, I would say that, the 80s, which had some great football, grew in popularity, and the passing game, grew, and the West Coast offense. And I think the next landmark that people need to know about is free agency. Players wanting the ability to, at the end of their contract, go to any team they wanted to, negotiate their contract as a free agent. And that's the American way, right? I mean, it was only a matter of time. It only took 80 years, but that first year of free agency, some of the agents for change pushing for that. Reggie White, a very famous football player we'll talk about. In Green Bay, there's a quarterback named Don Majkowski, the Magic Man. He was one of the big people who pushing for wanting to be able to negotiate his contract. And free agency came about. And boy, that has changed the face of football, hasn't it?
Yeah, and it came about roughly 25 years after it did in Major League Baseball. And so football was taking its lead and did in a lot of labor struggles from Major League Baseball, which was a very and always has been a very player-friendly league ever since, I should say, the breakthrough in free agency. Curt Flood and 1968, and then took hold in the 70s, and the NFL followed suit roughly 20 years later.
There's an irony that also kind of flows through the 70s, 80s, and really even up to today. We're going to talk about, through the course of our time on air, a man named Pete Rozelle. He was a commissioner of football for many, many, many years, and his hallmark was the idea of parity. In other words, setting things up so that teams that weren't good now could become good, and teams that were good now would maybe kind of dwindle down, so that all fans, from the smallest market in Green Bay to the biggest market in LA or New York, could have hope that over a few years' time, their team could turn things around and they would be competitive, right? And we won't get into the details, but that was Pete Rozelle's driving force when he was the commissioner of football. But ironically, the rules changes that we've already alluded to that came under his watch made it so that eventually it became such a quarterback-centric game that it sort of defeated the hope of parity keeping everybody interested. And we still saw dynasties in the 80s, dynasties in the 90s, and certainly a dynasty over the last 20 years as well. So kind of offsetting outcomes.
And two fascinating topics for a later date that I think of when you say parity, that to me represent that approach more than anything, would be the NFL draft and the schedule.
Right. Exactly. That's right. And again, those two forces have been butting heads ever since, the immovable object and the irresistible force. But I think we don't have the parity that Pete Rozelle would have hoped for, perhaps. But that's a debate.
Izzy, another irony that we're having this discussion today, in which it was announced that we would go to a 17-game NFL schedule, and that we also bring up the year 1978 as being a landmark year. Well, that was the introduction of the 16-game schedule from the 14-game schedule in 1977 that has been continuous from 1978 through yesterday.
And mentally, we have an idea, benchmarks, how many yards should a running back run for, how many yards should the quarterback throw for, but that's based upon our knowledge of a 16-year season. When we see numbers from the 70s, we go, that wasn't very good. Now that's all going to be turned on its head with a 17th game. So interesting.
Yeah, it's
and so I would say that free agency and the advent of the passing game have dominated the last segment of NFL history to where we are. That's simplified, but expansion is part of what happened in there too. As the league became popular, they expanded into markets, teams moving, things like that, dotted the landscape. But I think we've given a pretty good overview from its inception to today of the important points along the way that anyone who wants to understand how we got where we are today, where it all came from.
It's going to be so much fun, and it's going to be fascinating, and we're going to get down to the granular and take a historic event, game, player, coach, figure in the sport. Again, we would love to have people, our viewers here, chime in with your requests for topics, but there's a zillion things that we've mentioned over the last hour or so that we will dive and take a deep dive into as individual topics for future episodes, for sure.
I think that puts a bow on this first inaugural kickoff episode of the Pro Football History Channel.
Izzy, it's been fun. Again, lock it in here at Pro Football History, and we will see you soon and get those requests in. Okay, so that
49